Welcome to the Yale Center for British Arts online program. I'm Luis Carranza. I'm visiting professor at the Yale School of Architecture, and I'm delighted to welcome Fabiola López-Durán and Patricio del Real to our program today to discuss the work of the Italian-born Brazilian modernist architect, Lina Bo Bardi. This program is in conjunction with the multi-channel film installation, Isaac Julien, Lina Bo Bardi, A Marvellous Entanglement, which is currently on view at the Yale School of Architecture until December 10th. This project is a collaboration with the Yale Center for British Art and the Yale School of Architecture. Before we begin, I have a few housekeeping notes. Please keep in mind that this program will be recorded. Your camera and sound are muted and will remain so throughout the program. We will be using the question and answer feature, which is located on your navigation bar, to gather your questions for Fabiola and Patricio, and they will be answered at the end of the program. But please feel free to submit your questions at any time. If you would like closed captioning, a live transcript is available by clicking the icon on your navigation bar. Now, Yale University acknowledges that indigenous people and nations, including the Mohegan, Mashantucket Pequot, the Eastern Pequot, the Shattuckuk, the Golden Hill Pagusset, the Niantic, and the Quinnipiac and other Algonquian-speaking people have stewarded through generations the lands and waterways of what is now the state of Connecticut. We honor and respect the enduring relationship that exists between these people and nations and this land. I want to introduce our speakers today. Fabiola López-Durán is Associate Professor of Art and Architectural History at Rice University. Her research and teaching interrogate the cross-pollination of ideas and mediums, aesthetics, politics, and science that ignited the process of modernization on both sides of the Atlantic, with an emphasis on Latin America. Her broad research agenda focuses on the complicities between capitalism, racism, and the construction of the built environment. Patricio del Real is an architectural historian who works on modern architecture and its transnational connections with a focus on the Americas. He explores the changing ideological maps and geographies of modernity and the ways in which cultural and racial imaginaries have shaped the story of modern architecture. He is an associate professor of the history of art and architecture, modern architecture at Harvard University. The way that the presentation will proceed is Fabiola and Patricio are doing a joint presentation, and we'll go back and forth in that presentation. And then at the very end, we will open the field for questions and answers. So I thank you for joining us, and I cede the Zoom to you, Patricio.
Patricio,
You're muted, Patricio.
you need to unmute.
Important, unmute. Thank you. First of all, thank you for the organizers for organizing this wonderful event. Thank you, of course, Luis, for the introductions, and Fabiola for this kind of wonderful opportunity to have interacted and have a conversation with you through our preparations, but also now through our presentations. If you can start the PowerPoint. I don't see it. Is it on?
Yeah, it is on. Linda, can you go back one?
Oh, I see. 1 second. Yes, now I see it. Yes. Okay. Thank you. Now I see it. Sorry. Okay. Bicho extraño. Okay, can we go one forward and I'll just say next? Okay, we start with this strange bug. Next. I want to start with this view of Lina Bo Bardi's Museo de Artes de Sao Paulo at night from the 17th floor of a nearby building on Avenida Paulista, to underscore the strangeness of this horizontal building in the midst of a vertical city. A bicho extraño, we can call it, a strange animal, perhaps one of those that Lina, as she's known in Brazil, will turn to later in her life, but that reveals her preoccupation in position with respect to the city and to urbanity in the early 1960s. Next. Lina's main concern with MASPI, with the museum, was that of meaning. As she stated, in designing the Trianon, the new Trianon, my first concern was with its semantic order, a building that immediately communicates its being, that does not give rise to false interpretations or misunderstandings. The site in Avenida Paulista was the second headquarters for the Museo de Arte de Sao Paulo. Next. As is well known, the building's singular structural solution, a 70-meter long by 8-meter high free span, allows for a stunning public plaza on Avenida Paulista level and a magnificent 2-story open gallery inside the building that we see here. Next. And here we have 2 recent images that I took because I was there happily in 2 months ago in August. You see here the plaza, and next we see a view of the interior with the display has been reestablished as it intended. Here the main gallery with the very famous and spectacular glass easels. Next. The structural solution by José Carlos de Figueiredo Ferraz is that of a long span frame, 4 piers connected on the top by 2 pre-stressed concrete beams hold the roof, as you can see in the image to the right. 2 internal hollow beams that sit on the piers support the floor housing the 2-story gallery in the museum. The floor beneath, which holds all of the museum programs, hangs from the 2 beams by means of steel rods. And we see here on the image to the left, the steel rods holding that hold the floor with more of the bureaucratic aspects of the museum. All the horizontal slabs, the floor, the gallery, the roof, the gallery floor, and the museum office are cantilevered 5 meters on both ends. An open air staircase and elevator offer vertical connections. Next. Below the plaza are more galleries, the auditorium, and a restaurant. The plaza's platform and its urban void mediate between the suspended bar that we see on the left and encrusted horizontal plates grafted on the hillside. And we see here to the right, a parallel section parallel to Avenida Paulista to the first top 2, the one that cuts through the auditorium, the second one that cuts through the gallery underneath, and then we have the cross section that shows the platforms and how it opens to the rest of the city. Next. From Avenida Paulista, the building creates a magnificent frame, capturing a panoramic perspective that made the site a favorite hangout of elite society in what was known as the Trianon Belvedere that we see here to the left. From the Trianon, the future opened to Paulista's eye, inciting the spirit of the banderiantes, the fortune hunters of early colonial Brazil. Next. In architecture, this magnificent vista allows us to speak of those fantastic representations of ideal cities that, as Erwin Panofsky noted in his foundational 1924 perspective as symbolic form, relied on the representational mode of perspective to introduce a bold idea of a rational and order humanistic city. I want to propose that with MASPI, Lina responded to a crisis of representation in modern architecture that we can draw back to this moment of the ideal city, a crisis underpinned by the inability of the modernist project to keep moving forward, that is, to project a humanist future. Next. Maspy's structural solution, the 70-meter-long span and its frame, was underpinned by Lina's desire for communication, for an architecture parlante, for a speaking architecture. I eliminated all free solutions, she stated, even if at first glance they seem more interesting, to design a simple, collected, and honest form. The use of such tremendous structural solution, Lina asserted, was not the result of an architectural eccentricity, nor of an expression of stylistic originality, but of an imperative, the creation of a simple and honest form that could communicate. Next. Here on the left, we see an early proposal for Maspy with structural frames perpendicular to Avenida Paulista, forming a colonnade on the avenue. And on the right, we see the south elevation of Kalman, McKinnell, and Knowles Boston City Hall with a pier colonnade holding the large office-filled entablature. In both instances, the rhythmic colonnade is used as a sign of civic monumentality. The notion of brutalism in architecture may offer some insights on the question of speaking forms. After all, Lina's insistence on a simple and honest solution echoes positions of architects across the globe at this time, who claim reinforced concrete's materiality, its authenticity, as a significant and signifying condition of the material itself. In all, they claim concrete's capacity to speak of a real world. Despite their programmatic differences, these buildings can be brought together on the use, of course, of reinforced concrete, on the symbolic and symbolizing material to express civic monumentality, in line with a Western architectural tradition. Let's not forget that according to Sybil Moholy-Nagy, the significance of the new Boston City Hall lied in historical continuity made contemporary, which one can translate as living with columns. Next. Was Lina interested in historical continuity? The search for a civic monumentality in Brazil, as evidenced by Maspy's final structural solution and many other buildings in Sao Paulo, was underpinned by the long span. Lina, however, wanted to distance herself from any accusation of structural exhibitionism, very much in vogue at the time, advancing the idea that the structural solution was imposed by a legal mandate to keep the Trianon Plaza free of any structure or program. As Italian architectural historian Daniele Pisani has recently made clear through an exhaustive and detailed archival research, Maspy's structural solution was not the consequence of any legal requirement to keep the plaza or its magnificence view. In other words, there was no prohibition of not using structural columns or walls on the plaza, or even to eliminating the plaza altogether. After all, Maspy was and remains a private institution. Of course, there were informal pressures to keep the platform, the plaza, imposed by the traditional use of the Belvedere. But there was also the use of public monies to build Maspy, a private museum led by Pietro Maria Bardi, Lina's husband, and controlled by Assis de Chateaubriand, who owned a media empire, Diarios Asociados. The use of public monies was done without public debate or knowledge, so the magnificent plaza may have been the result of a quid pro quo. Next. It is telling that Figueiredo Ferraz, the structural engineer who led the office and calculated, led the engineering office and calculated this portentous structure, was the Secretary of Public Works of the city of Sao Paulo at the time, and later will become mayor of the city. We must then insist on Lina's fixation with the correct message that this portentous structural order would carry, an honest structure underpinned, according to the new evidence uncovered, by a somewhat muddled dishonest account. A possible answer to this murky affair, or pact with the devil, so common in the world where cities become the stage of power relations, may be the paradoxical relationship that the act of levitation creates, for it produces a kind of triumphal arch / megaform that elevates and protects art above the plane of everyday life. And at the same time, this act of levitation introduces a void that requires the activity of signification. In other words, a void that needs to be filled. Next. Lina was clearly cognizant of this void in the city, for she filled it with diverse, wonderful projects, mobilizing, for example, here to the left, popular expressions, as in the project for the circus, or to the right, with, in this case, African art in the form of a sculpture garden. These ideas manifest a space of possibility, of sheer dynamic multiplicity. In other words, a space of hope. Next. But these and other projects to fill the void also record a profound uneasiness with the instability of signification in architecture that required a portentous structural expression for clarity and honesty of expression. I want to propose that if the long span structure deployed by Lina allows for a space of possibility, it does so by engaging a void produced by modernity itself, that is, a void produced by destructive processes of technological modernization in a vicious cycle of destruction and creation. The destructive process is the devil that hides in the accordo, in the agreement between the public sphere and the private sphere that enable must be. Can Lina's megaform, put in the service of art and urbanity, contain the violence of modernity? With these questions, I pass the baton to Fabiola.
Thank you, Patricio. Okay, so next, Linda, please. So let me start with the same two drawings just shown by Patricio at the end of his statement. Two images that bring popular culture and African culture to the center of modernism in Brazil. Next. As we all know, Lina Bo Bardi was fascinated by Brazilian popular culture, by the artistic production of indigenous communities, and by the African traditions assimilated in Brazil. Here we see some of these, some images of exhibitions, sketches, and her own house inhabited by all these different creatures. Next. It is not by chance that in order to access the museum and its celebrated European art collection, she imagined a circus and an exhibition of African artworks sprawling throughout the plaza, as she also imagined wild tropical nature taking over the massive concrete canopy of the elevated museum. Next. But how is Lina's fascination with folk art, indigenous and African cultures, and tropical nature different from European fetishization of so-called primitive cultures? How, for instance, is this different from the colonial world inhabited by Le Corbusier, Pablo Picasso, and André Breton, just to mention a few? Or indeed, next, different from the no less problematic celebration by the Brazilian avant-garde of the Black and the Indian and their milieus, the very targets of transformation of the Eugenics movement. In other words, non-white people and tropical environments. How is that different from them? Next. Is Lina Bo Bardi's work connected to colonialism in the same way as the work of other modernist architects in Brazil, such as Lúcio Costa, the famous architect responsible for supermodern Brasilia, who described its crucifix urban form as the historical sign of conquest, the primary gesture of one who marks or takes possession of a place. Next. Is Lina Bo Bardi's work another expression of modernism complicity with colonialism? So let's look at her first years in Brazil. Next. In 1950, as part of MASP's pedagogical quest to educate Sao Paulo's growing middle class, the Bardis, so Lina and her husband, Pietro, launched a new art and design magazine titled Habitat, Revista das Artes no Brasil. The first 15 issues of Habitat, which they edited, clearly embody a modernist vocabulary to present modernist architectural projects and artworks vis-a-vis indigenous craft and artifacts. Modernist buildings, gardens, artworks, and furniture, including her own house in Morumbi, the Itarare Beach Museum in São Vicente, and her zigzag chair designed in 1949 in collaboration with Giancarlo Spallanzini, were included in the abstract graphic composition of the magazine's covers, next to utilitarian objects, popular craft, sculptural ceramics by the Carajá people, and even the traditional outdoor ovens that Bo Bardi added to her modernist glass house, all affirming the dominant connection between modernism and primitivism. Next. Paulo Tavares, the architect, curator, and professor at the Universidade de Brasília, has interrogated this connection in his 2018 graphic textual project, The Habitat, a reformulation of Bo Bardi's magazine. In this project, Tavares examined how these indigenous objects, extracted from their original context, were reappropriated for her magazine as signifiers of modernity. Next. Tavares includes archival images and tests to reveal the historical context and colonial strategies that were not included in Habitat. I'm referring to the state policies of land confiscation and forced displacements of indigenous groups, which were the very reason behind the circulation of these objects and their autonomous presence in urban settings. Next. By the time Habitat published its first issue, over 100 posts created by the Ministry of Agriculture and its state agency, the Servicio de Protección dos Indios, or the Indigenous Protection Service, were established in ancestral indigenous lands in Brazil, exercising their colonial strategies to control the movement of these communities and to take over their lands, resources, and culture. I think that it's also interesting to notice how the term Indios is used over and over again, reproducing the mistake that was made in the 16th century when the Spaniards arrived in the Americas and they thought that they were arriving to the rich, spice East Indians. Next. Tavares even demonstrates how the Carajá ceramics that appears next to Lina's, so Linda, I'm having you in my mind, Lina's colorful drawing of a tropical garden and over a photo of a brise-soleil the modern environmental aesthetic device created to shield buildings from intense sunlight that was required in tropical climates, were taken and photographed by the so-called Service for the Protection of the Indigenous and exhibited next in the lobby of the Hotel Juscelino Kubitschek, the building designed by Oscar Niemeyer as part of a modern colonial development on the Banana Island in the ancient lands of the Carayas. Next. Niemeyer even called it Rancho Pioneiro, a name associated with the Portuguese colonial conquest. So here we are talking about things that are not only symbolic, but very real in terms of coloniality. Next. What was neglected in Habitat precisely reveals the coupling of coloniality and modernity, both with their roots in the racist, patriarchal logic of the colonial system. So this term coloniality is the express organization of oppression at work globally. In contrast to colonialism, the historical process of material and cultural domination of one people over another group of people, coloniality, in the words of Peruvian scholar Aníbal Quijano, is, quote, the most general form of domination in the world today, once colonialism as an explicit political order was destroyed. But coloniality survived colonialism. It is alive in books, in museums, in the academy, in the way we denigrate others to empower ourselves, and in so many other aspects of our modern existence. Walter Mignolo, another scholar from the Global South, argues that there is no modernity without coloniality, that coloniality is, in fact, the reversible and unavoidable side of modernity, is darker, hidden side, and that coloniality is constitutive and not derivative of modernity. So it is, next, please. So it is clear that the Lina of Habitat was very different from, let's say, the Lina who came to visualize, next, a diverse world cohabiting the large plaza under the massive canopy of Maspi. It is also clear that Lina's relationship to the popular indigenous and Afro-Brazilian culture, next, as Ana Maria León has shown in her work on Bo Bardi's exhibitions, was more self-aware of her Eurocentric gaze than most of her male contemporaries, such as Le Corbusier and Lucio Costa. But it is imperative to recognize that, next, modern architecture, as we know it, has always been deeply invested in maintaining the inequality and environmental destruction that was initiated by the elimination and displacements of people and the colonial appropriation of their resources in the European conquest of the Americas. And it is imperative to recognize that architectural scholarship has blatantly ignore this connection between coloniality and modernity that is at the core of our discipline. So, Patricio, let's continue.
Thank you, Paola. Fabiola. We're with the names. Estamos con los nombres hoy. And la próxima, next, please. Police. The Minhocan, or the worm. Next, please. As Maspi opened to frame the destiny of Sao Paulo in 1969, the military government that had come to power in 1964 released its own bicho extraño, its own strange animal upon the city. A series of elevated highways, popularly known as the Minhocão or the Wern, launched by the government of Paulo Maluf, the mayor appointed by the military government, 7 kilometers of highways cut through Sao Paulo to put in place the circulation ideology that underpins modernism and its utopias. Built with impressive speed in 14 months with a non-stop 24-hour, 7-day-a-week construction schedule, it opened in January 1971. Demolitions started in 1969 under the slogan, Sao Paulo, cidade que se humaniza. Sao Paulo, the city is being humanized. As urban theorist Henri Lefebvre argues, one should not underestimate the role of violence in modernization under capitalist accumulation. In other words, violence is cloaked in rationality. Here, the rationality of circulation, of mobility, of speed, and exchange. Next. That same year, in 1969, the year demolition started for the highway, Teatro Oficina staged Bertolt Brecht's play In the Jungle of Cities with a stage designed by Lina Bo Bardi. The location of Teatro Oficina is here in this spread of Manchete on the right, where the Minhocão kind of disappears right there to the left. Sorry, I don't have a pointer with me. It is there right at the edge where the highway ends, to the left where that tower is below. That's where Teatro Oficina is located. Teatro Oficina is a theater group founded by C. Celso in 1958. It was closed in 1973 by the military government. It came back to this site with a design by Lina Bo Bardi and Edson Elito 2 years after Lina's death in 1994. Next, please. For In the Jungle of Cities, Lina designed a boxing ring that would be reduced to ruins throughout the performance. This was a provocative proposition, a ritual of destruction and creation that, as Guillerme Wisnik characterizes as essentially sacrificial. Next. To create the stage, Lina used debris created by the construction of the Minhocão, the military's construction worm, trees, sidewalk, woods, debris, materials, and everyday objects from demolished houses of the neighborhood. Next. With Lina's design, the actual experience of the city being lived at that moment in time overtook realism by enacting Brecht's epic theater in a direct relationship between the theatrical stage and the urban stage. Lina's design exposed the violence of modernist representation as everyday lived experience under the regime of modernization, as a cyclical and unending regime of vicious destruction and creation. The theater, a stage of contestatory social conflict, confronted the city as theater of authoritarian development. If the city was being humanized, as the military government facetiously claimed, our humanity was left only with and in ruins. Next. Throughout her career, Lina developed innovative display techniques. In the early 1960s, at this very moment in time, during her stay in Salvador, Bahia, she had engaged Brecht Theater in the production of the Three-Penny Opera, where she engaged the notion of the ruin in the burned down 1954 modernist Castro Alves Theater. In Salvador stage design, the ruined architecture coexisted with temporary structures that created platforms and stairs in a project that starts to outline the future project for Teatro Oficina. But do these two projects that we see here, which are about the same time, inform each other? Does the ruin inform Maspi, and does Maspi inform the ruin? Is the relationship between Lina's theatrical engagements with the ruined city and Maspi, a museum located at an infrastructural node of the city, do they connect? Next. Does the violence of modernization underpin the rationality of Lina's megaform? Under the military rule that started in 1964, that is 4 years before the opening of Maspi, the belief in industrial modernization under the rubric of what was termed developmentalism that had launched the project for the new capital of Brasilia in 1956 that Fabiola has referred to, turned into a ferocious technocratic transformation of the natural and the built environment with repercussions that we live today. The long span used by Lina to both elevate and bury the museum reveals a new magnitude of modernization taking place in Brazil, a new order that galvanized the ruin of destruction and creation, the ritual of destruction and creation, foreclosing the modernist future. Next. What is to be done? Can a museum of art respond to the violence and the secret pacts that enable urban development? Is the levitating glass box uncontaminated by the forces that provoke morphological change in the city? Maspi's floating glass box may serve as an image of Lina's own position in the polis. As a member of the elite in the sphere of culture, Lina had an exceptional position. She maintained a distance from raging ideological battles. In a sense, she levitated above politics. Paradoxically, this allowed her to write strong political texts, stating positions that other architects engaged in the macropolitics of the country could not. Lina was able to open a space in which she could say things that needed to be said, but were not being said. In addition, her sojourn in Bahia allowed her to transform the idea of the people, o povo, from a political abstraction to one connected to the material world of the popular imagination. Next. Against the military's worm undermining and destroying the lived city, one can juxtapose Pinocchio's whale, built in 1984 for an exhibition on Pinocchio and the puppets as part of the factory of the imagination that is Ces Pompeia. Is this turn to bichos extraños, to strange animals, a form of retreat from the urban stage and from the violence of modernization, of technocratic modernization? Is Ces Pompeia a protective enclave of the imagination that parallels Maspi's lift of art above the plane of the everyday? As Foucault reminds us, retreat is not necessarily escapism, a refusal to engage the world. A retreat can be an engaged and active withdrawal, a refusal that can cause power relations to crumble. In other words, retreat can be understood as part of micropolitics. Next. Pompeia is but one in a series of urban enclaves developed by the Servicio Social de Comercio, the social service of commercial employees. SESC is a mixed entity a private entity subsidized by the government for the workers of the private commerce sector. SESC is part of a set of institutions created in the 1940s to enhance the lives of workers in different areas of the Brazilian economy. Next. SESC Pompeia rises from a flat L-shaped industrial corner lot, an alley with 2 rows of industrial sheds that we see here in the plan to the left, plus an adjoining lot with a creek running from one end to the other. Lina recycled the sheds in which one finds in the left hand, in the lower part of the L, on the top part, a cafeteria, a storeroom, then below the center's administration, a large covered plaza with a library and exhibition space, a theater, and workshops. A transversal passage that we see here, edge on the right. In between, a transversal passage between the sort of plaza with the lagoon area was roofed to become the theater foyer. The creek on the very end of the plan is covered by a boardwalk. Next. 2 sculptural concrete towers anchor one end. The lower tower holds a swimming pool on the ground floor and 4 sports courts above. The lower tower holds the swim is connected to the tall tower via walkways or skyways, truly. The taller tower holds the vertical circulation, lockers, exercise rooms, and the slender concrete reservoir that we see in front, detailed with horizontal bands, we call industrial chimneys, and exhibits its process of construction. Next. SESC Pompeia is a magnificent urban oasis. It imports the energy of the neighborhood by repurposing existing structures to create new relationships serving a social program. But Pompeia is also an urban fragment, an enclosure in a fragmented city. There is a newfound liberty to architectural fragments, beholden no longer to panoramic perspectives, to urban totalities. Next. Yet, at Pompeia, the city is not abandoned. Urban elements are mobilized in a process of resignification. The transversal passage, a small street that was roofed to become the theater foyer, pressing on the idea of the street as an urban stage par excellence. The creek come boardwalk that becomes an urban beach. These design moves recall that for Teatro Oficina, design in a pre-existing structure that we see here to the left, a narrow lot, 9 meters wide by 50 meters long, with a 3-meter height differential between the front and the back. And we're here looking from the back towards the front, towards the entry, sorry. And in the left-hand corner, you see sort of the boardwalk made of wooden slats. The driving idea was that of the street, which connects the entry, again, from the back to the front, activating the full length of the space. The street, a piece of urban lexicon, organizes a space conceived as a total theater that invites the individual spectator in, after, or even during performances, propels them out of the city, into the city, as a collective body. This mechanism meets and confronts the Minocao, the elevated highway that we see here through the glass, right kind of in the middle of the photograph. We can see the Minocao, the elevated highway, and its haunting macropolitics of violence with a ritual. It confronts this highway with a ritual creativity of social solidarity. Next. Lina's SESC Pompeia, its use, reuse, and resignification of industrial modernity has provoked much deserved celebration. The collaborative design abandoned the homogenizing top-down logic of modernity through strategic interventions and alternative building in material practices. Next. But I want to sound a warning. Lina's early tactics, what today we can call adaptive reuse, have been co-opted by the speculative real estate and luxury markets and have become strategies of gentrification. A brief story of this co-optation could start with the Massachusetts Museum of Contemporary Art, MASMOCA, which served as a template for similar cultural developments in the United States, such as Dia Beacon. In 1986, a team led by Thomas Krenz, the then director of Williams College Museum of Art, remade a factory complex in Massachusetts into a contemporary art center that opened in 1999. Krenz, as is well known, will later become the director of the New York's Guggenheim Museum, expanding its global foothold, most notoriously, as is well known, in Bilbao. More recently, that is, as of 2023, cultural entrepreneur Michael Dorf, who we see here on the right, and who owns a network of 14 restaurant wineries in 11 cities across the United States, has been scouting abandoned factories in the Hudson Valley, and he has settled in Walden, New York, where he plans to convert a burned out factory into a boutique hotel, a winery and restaurant, a spa, and of course, an art gallery. It seems then that today, the explosion of spectacular images of architecture across the globe goes hand in hand with opportunist adaptive reuse strategies of recycling the industrial past, two sides of the same coin. Although we can hardly frame Lina as a gentrifier, the global economy has repurposed the tactics of reuse and resignification she deployed in the late 1970s. Retooled as weapons for gentrification, these strategies become devoid of any polemical stance and thus offer no real alternative. What is to be done? It seems that architecture needs new lines of flight, new strategies of escape, if it is to offer any hope for meaningful social legibility. Only by opening new spaces will we find alternative to the vicious cycle of destruction and creation unleashed by modernity. Fabiola, pass it to you.
Thank you, Patricio. Okay, so let's finish these three statements with this pair concept of repair and redress. Next, please. So Sesky Pompeia was also the place that allowed Lina to materialize some of the ideas she began developing during the culturally effervescent years she lived in Salvador Bahia. Ideas about the convergence of different regimes of cultural production and learning, as well as innovative forms of infrastructure revitalization that were frustrated by the repressive political landscape established after the 1964 military coup d'etat. Next. But without her experience in Bahia, working with the local community to restore a 16th century architectural ensemble, the Solar do União, to host institutions as diverse as the Museum of Modern Art, the Museum of Popular Art, a school museum project that included a documentation center for popular handicraft, and a school of design that will bring together industrial designers and artisans. It seems almost impossible to imagine that she could have created such a place as Sesky Pompeia. Next. In 1986, when Lina was invited to make a proposal for the center of Salvador, the historical colonial plateau was almost in ruins, largely neglected during the 2 decades of military dictatorship. recognizing that the process of revitalization had to be driven by the agency and values of the community, Lina clearly rejected the idea of restoration as a process of perfect restitution of a particular time or style, as well as the possibility of transforming the historical center of Bahia into what she called, quote, an ice cream city, quote, for tourists, and its consequential acts of gentrification and segregation. And here we see in these working plans of Lina, how she was identifying all the buildings that were on ruins. Next. As an architect ahead of her time, she invited the mayor of the city and the team working on its overhaul to look beyond the infrastructure in order to capture the unstructured, the messy human experience that inhabits the urban landscape. So she was actually trying to do what we are being called to do by people such as, I'm missing her last name. Oh, I have her last name, her book here. Sorry about this, but I really think that I need to mention her. Svati Chattopadhyay, with her book on learning the city, that she's inviting all of us to unlearn infrastructure. So, in other words, she wanted to focus not on the architecture in need of restoration, but on the food, the music, the dance, traditions, on the people. As she declared, quote, "We are not going to touch anything, but we will touch everything," end quote. Her complex master plan for Salvador included the rehabilitation of public spaces and abandoned buildings for the creation of new community spaces and cultural centers, some of them in cooperation with international organizations and with a clear focus on the African heritage of the city. Next. So I would like to briefly refer to two of them. So one of the most idiosyncratic projects of this master plan for Salvador Bahia was the consolidation of what came to be called Ladeira de Misericordia, the slope of mercy, a road that took its name from colonial times when enslaved men and women were forced to carry heavy goods from the city's port to the historical center of Salvador. Next. So Lina proposed what she conceived as a pilot project to stabilize the many dilapidated structures, rehabilitating the buildings along the road for housing, small retail stores, workshops, and a restaurant for the community. Next. Using a modular prefabricated concrete system to stabilize the ruins, add new structures, consolidating open spaces, and honor the brokenness of the city, its fragmentation, and the tropical vegetation that has long grown around it. Next. So another significant project for the rehabilitation of the city was the African Brazilian Community Center, Casa do Benin, the result of a bilateral agreement between Salvador Bahia and the Republic of Benin in West Africa, the place of origin of most of the enslaved people taken to Bahia. Developed in collaboration with ethnographer Pierre Berger. Next, please. The project included the restoration of 3 18th century buildings on Praça do Pelourinho, a tropical courtyard, and a straw hut evoking rural sub-Saharan architecture to host a communal table for meetings. Next. So here we see, the colonial buildings, and then the construction that was evoking rural sub-Saharan architecture. Next, please. And for this, once again, Lina employed the same prefabricated concrete system used for Ladeira da Misericordia to hold the architectural assemblage vis-a-vis natural materials such as eucalyptus trunks and other fibers and soil, using humble constructions in both Africa and Brazil. Next. So everything Lina did in Bahia reconceived architecture as acts of repair. We all know that architecture has been instrumental in materializing inequality, destroying the environment, and prioritizing technology over people and nature. Instead, she saw architecture as a means to recover lands, recover the city, recover bodies, and a way of life. Lina was not afraid to exploit the decay and erosion of the built environment for the sake of redressing the multiple injustice, racial and environmental, that modernity and coloniality so carelessly imposed. Next. But as much as repair, Lina's fundamental concern was also centered around the issue of redress. In English, the word redress has two meanings: to remedy or correct an injustice or an undesirable situation, and to set upright again. So the first meaning is clear in Lina's work, as she sets out to redress the deep, innumerable social injustices against indigenous and Afro-Brazilian communities, including the way they were ignored and neglected. But the second meaning, to set upright again, is equally important. Not in the sense that she wants to redress the leaning and crumbled walls of the historic center of Salvador, but returning them to their once pristine and upright conditions. Rather, her ambition was that architecture set upright again the people of Brazil. And I would like to finish with this image of these two workers and the cooling tower of Sesqui Pompeia producing flowers rather than contamination. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you for such a beautiful crafted presentation and a very thought-provoking kind of set of ideas and kind of concepts and critiques that you're kind of engaging in about Lina's work. We have a couple of questions on the question and answer. If people have more questions, please type them up. I just wanted to kind of maybe just ask one general question, just to help those people who may not necessarily be familiar with Brazilian architecture. I wonder if you could situate Lina's work within the context of other Brazilian modernists. You talked a little bit about Oscar Niemeyer, but I wonder if you could talk about her in relationship to the Paulista school and to the Carioca school, just to kind of give us a sense of where she sits relative to Brazilian modernism.
Do you want to start, Patricio?
Me first.
Well, I will say that I think that Lina is a sort of antithesis of Lucio Costa and Oscar Niemeyer. I think that there is a similarity in the vocabulary and use of materials. But I think that they were really responding in completely different ways to the situation in Brazil. So I started in my first statement on coloniality being critical of that very first period in which she also participated of this kind of Eurocentric gaze that was decontextualizing and instrumentalizing the cultural production of indigenous people into a modernist narrative, right? And what that means when we do something like that, which is what modernism has been doing over and over again. In the case of Lucio Costa, he was very, 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 very open about assuming this kind of combined position of modernity and coloniality. There is, I mean, from his early writings in the 1920s, in which he made that very clear in the late 1920s, when, for instance, in a newspaper article in 1928, he made a very clear eugenic syllogism that he basically, by claiming the need for selective immigration, he was saying that good breeding will create good government and will create good architecture, and thinking that that could also work on reverse, that good architecture will be able to create good government and to create good people. But he was doing that in a way that was very clear that he was talking about race, and that he was feeling really conflicted by the presence of indigenous and African people in the social body of Brazil. And then, you know, as I quoted him today, for Brasilia, it was the materialization of all these ideas that they started appearing from the late 1920s. But, you know, this in relation to the Carioca school, like maybe Patricio, you want to say something about it?
Yeah, I mean, I would like to add that in the 1920s, I mean, there's a historical space between Costa, Niemeyer, Levy, Regi, Carmen Portinho, and Lina, right? These are people who are working since the teen. I mean, even before, and Fabiola knows this very well, even before Costa's turn to modernism, he's already thinking, right, about architecture, in this case in the neocolonial style, but a style that is part of modernity, right? So these issues, they've been working with these in the 1920s or 30s. The entire world thought about race, right? There was a war, right? A Second World War on race, right? So that conjunction, right, of trying to think the nation through race is not, I would argue, particular to Brazil. We have it, and Luis, you know this very well, we have it in Mexico as well, right? And we have it in Argentina, we have it in Spain, we have it in Germany, we have it in Italy, we have it, it's kind of, it's an international discourse, right? So how you respond to that international discourse, in a particular discourse that, as Fabiola knows very well, has been brewing in Brazil for a very long time. It's a highly complex and charged and rich and proposition. So when Lina enters Brazil in 1947, right, there's a lot going on, and there's also, as Fabiola's commenting, and Luis, as you suggest, there's also a consolidation already of what is known as the Carioca school, right? So there's a very particular context that she enters in a very rich architecture culture, very, very complex, but many contradictions. I think that actually I believe she actually engages with, as I tried to show, right? I think there is a moment of certain revelation, right? That many people have argued when she goes to Bahia, right? There is kind of that moment of revelation, and without Bahia, right, there is no Lina as we know her. Absolutely, and she kind of starts to unravel, right? And what I find quite interesting is like this is all happening at the same time that she's building MASPI, right? Which is this kind of signature piece of modernity, of industrial modernity. So that's what I find fascinating about her, that she's full of contradictions and really working all this very early on already by the late 50s, right? She's already having this kind of thought-provoking sort of transformation, it's an internal transformation. I'll leave it at that.
Hey, let me ask some of the questions from the question and answer, just to give people that opportunity. Let me see. Just I guess there was a quick one of what was the reference to a book, Learning the City, that you gave? I guess that was Fabiola.
That's Fabiola.
About that.
What was the question? Sorry.
What was the reference to the Learning the City?
Well, I can show it to you. I have it right here. It's on Learning the City by Svati Chattopadhyaya. I hope that I'm pronouncing her last name correctly.
Okay. I thought that was going to be an easy one. Another question is, what would you say you like most about Lina Bo Bardi's work? That's a big one.
For me, her transformation, her constant sort of transformation and ability always to remain open to possibilities. But also, I think for me, the most important lesson is the conjunction of modernity and ancestrality that she learns and develops in Bahia. Because it is not a return to a romanticized view, right? She's using prefabricated materials. She's using engineers, the prefabricated materials that she used in Bahia that Fabiola mentioned. They were work in conjunction and in collaboration with Lele. All right, so she's not negating industrial technology, right? She's taming it, if you will, and repurposing it. So we cannot accuse her of being a romantic, right? If there is any sense of retreat, but that I would actually preposition that Bahia is a form of retreat. It is not a retreat that disengages, right? It is a retreat that allows her to reformulate a position within modernity itself.
Yeah, and I will say, like, a sort of like, I'm with Patricio also. I feel I will second every single thing that you said, but I will add to that I love from Lina's work the contaminated nature of her work. In a way, what I'm saying is that she's not creating an architecture that is perfect. So I would say contaminated and imperfect nature of her work, right? That is perfect, that is impermeable, right? Is actually something that has that capacity of permanent change, right? That has the capacity for the different humans and non-human animals to coexist, that has the capacity for tropical nature to be as lush and wild as it is. You know, that has that kind of possibilities for different forms of knowledge, different forms of learning, different forms of existence to be to coexist, to be together.
We have one more question, last question. Jane says it's okay. The question is, thank you for your amazing presentation. I understand that Bo Bardi's exhibition space design revolutionized museum space. But can you talk more about her interest in performance space? How does she incorporate that in her designs? Did she ever design theater spaces or other performance spaces outside of museums?
well, she did design Teatro Oficina, right, which is a theater, and as I pointed out, this comes early on already in the 50s, right, where this kind of the space of the theater, but space as space as performativity itself, which I think also Fabiola mentions in her, that she starts to develop also in relation to her work in Bahia, her urban work in Bahia, has to do very much so with performativity rather than right with a architectural space in the traditional line of modernism, right?
Yeah, and also if you think, for instance, about the theater that she created at Sesqui Pompeia, right? It's, I mean, like performativity in capital letters, right? Like we have like actually not only the performance, the show that is happening at the center, but also the background is the same audience, the same people for the two sides of this symmetrical space. So I think that it's very clear that for Lina, performativity was at the center of her architectural practice and her understanding of space. So space as that kind of place for something to occur, to happen. And I love the image of Isaac in his installation, Isaac Julien's, with this stair that she designed for the Museo de Arte Moderna in Bahia, and then this dancer, right, that is actually literally performing the staircase, right? Like how there is a sense of movement within the architecture that is very performatic.
I would add that if when you visit Cerro Doñao and you actually climb that stair, right? That stair is a stage. It truly it's not a stair. It's a stage, and that in architectural terms, if I would put it to a lineage, I would throw that is in line with Michelangelo's Lorenziana. As a stair, there's a space. There's all about the performativity of climb, or what is to climb a stair. I would actually put those two together because it is truly about this incredible ability that architecture has, right, to actually allow us to perform.
Great. I think we've run out of time, or we've gone over our time. So I thank you both, Fabiola and Patricio, for such a great presentation. I thank the Yale Center for British Art for allowing us to have this conversation. And so thank you very much. Have a great afternoon.
Yeah, thank you again.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you, Fabiola.
Thank you, Patricio. It was such a pleasure.
Hey,
all the
process. Do it again.
Yes, let's do
next
it
time.
again.
Next time over drinks with Luis also.
Exactly. Let's do that.
Great idea. Great idea.